Dan and Amy, when the president spoke to the UN General Assembly earlier this week, his signature line in his speech that was a course correction for global integration, that was the theme of his speech. His signature line, particularly as it pertains to the look forward at this presidential election, was this.
Today, a nation ringed by walls would only imprison itself. So the answer cannot be a simple rejection of global integration. Instead, we must work together to make sure the benefits of such integration are broadly shared.
I don't know that anybody is rejecting the idea of global integration, even the accusations against Trump of being a neo-isolationist of sorts, saying I'm running for president of the United States, not president of the world. But that's a different thing. It's perspective. It's not the idea that we can ignore our Western allies and allies throughout the world, as well as deal with the trouble spots. I'm pleased to have a special guest to discuss this. And I was going to do this interview in my native tongue of Danish because, as you know, I'm 50% Danish, Amy.
Uh-huh.
But then I remembered I don't speak Danish.
Oh, so you have to go back to English.
So that would be difficult. But the good news is former Danish Prime Minister and former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen speaks English. And we're pleased to be joined by him now. Prime Minister Rasmussen, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning.
So
for me.
So you've been quite busy penning op-eds, some very interesting ones over the last couple of days. One in the Wall Street Journal entitled "The United States Must Be the World's Policeman," and that has sort of a negative connotation, but I think the headline belies what you're saying. So when you say the U.S. should be the world's, or must be the world's policeman if we're going to have stability for freedom-loving people, what exactly do you mean in terms of a U.S. role?
Well, we need a policeman to restore law and order in the world. When you see the chaos and killings in the Middle East, Libya has become a failed state that is also a breeding ground for terrorism. Russia's reckless attack on Ukraine in Eastern Europe, China flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, the rogue state North Korea threatening neighbors and the U.S. with a nuclear attack, then it's very clear that we need a policeman to restore law and order in our world. And
just a clarification, the world's policeman sometimes to Americans sounds like, oh, here we go again, forays into nation building in the Middle East or far-flung places. And that's not necessarily what you're saying. You're saying provide leadership for Western liberal small L thinkers, not necessarily get into the business of occupying and nation building.
No, not necessarily. But what we do need is determined American global leadership. And it's deliberately that I use the word policeman because in some camps it's a bit controversial. But coming from Europe, coming from a small country in Europe, having been prime minister of that country, having been Secretary General of NATO, I have a very clear message to the Americans. You should act as the world's policeman because the United States is the only capable, desirable, and credible candidate to fill that post, not least because the U.S. is a benign democracy.
Well, just to further that point, though, when you say then America must be the world's policeman, what form does that take? Give me an example. America being the policeman to deal with Putin or other crooked autocrats you describe.
Well, of course, it can be in many forms that you conduct that task. And obviously, the U.S. shouldn't go it alone. I also argue that we, the Europeans, should engage more. We should pay more for our common security. But I'm really concerned that isolationism in the U.S. would lead to a global vacuum and that vacuum would be filled by the bad guys. We saw that before the Second World War. We have seen it time and again. So in due time before the American presidential elections, I am very clear in my message, my appeal to the American people. Please make sure that the next president will really engage in the world.
Well, speaking of presidential candidates, Donald Trump once suggested that NATO forces should come together and help fight ISIS, that more of a global effort should be made to defeat terrorists. What say you?
Yeah, I was a bit disturbed by Mr. Trump's statements on NATO, not least because his statements raised doubts about our collective defense, and that is really undermining the credibility of NATO and our Article 5, and I am concerned that President Putin would test the resolve of our alliance. So he would be tempted to continue his challenge of the American-led world order that so successfully was established after the Second World War.
Now, in terms of concerns that you have, in another op-ed, you call for the next president of the United States to create a so-called alliance for democracy, bring together the world's democracies in a strong alliance for democracy. Is that a formal institution you're proposing? And if so, is that a commentary on the UN or even to some extent NATO in their current forms?
Well, it's not a new formal international institution, but rather a regular gathering of the world's democracies. I do believe that the American president has a convening power, and that convening power should be used to establish such an alliance for democracy under American leadership. It should be composed not only of North American and European countries, but also democracies across the world like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India, not least, because we need a stronger liberal democratic supremacy in the world to counter the still more aggressive autocratic forces.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with the premise of your statement, but let me ask this. The great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises once said that he who wants to improve conditions must propagate a new mentality, not merely a new institution. Is there also a new mentality that needs to accompany these conferences, these alliances, these global institutions, a new mentality among the leadership of Western democracies?
Absolutely, yes. And I do believe that such an alliance for democracy could also push for profound reforms of the United Nations. And we really need that. On the one hand, we do need the United Nations as a forum for consultation and discussions among all the world's countries, whether they are democracies or autocracies. But on the other hand, we also need profound reforms, and I think they could be advanced by such an alliance for democracy. My point is that actually it is in the American self-interest to be the world's policeman, because if you retreat or is perceived to retreat, then the bad guys will hit in the U.S. as we saw 9/11, and the U.S. will prosper when peace and a rules-based world order is the dominant system in the world. So I think the Smith family in Peoria, at the end of the day, would realize how important it is to demonstrate determined American global leadership, and that is the U.S. should be the world's policeman.
So, as former Secretary General of NATO, I wanted to go back to something else that Donald Trump said, the presidential candidate. He made several comments alluding to the fact that the U.S. would pull out of NATO, and how catastrophic would that be for the remaining 27 countries? Would you still have NATO?
If the U.S. were to leave, then you wouldn't have NATO any longer. The essence of NATO is a transatlantic cooperation on security. And it is because of that cooperation that NATO has served as the bedrock of North Atlantic security since NATO was established in 1949. So no doubt that if you raise doubts about the U.S. engagement in NATO, then NATO will gradually fade away.
I wanted to get your take on this administration's the administration you've been critical of for leading from behind, their phraseology, their gambit with Iran. James Jeffrey, is a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey and Iraq, argued that Iran simply is not an acceptable partner in the war against terror. Is that an opinion you share as you talk about liberal democracies uniting to combat terror and other crooked autocrats?
Well, I do not trust the current regime in Iran. However, I don't think there is any realistic alternative to the agreement that was made. I think we should give it a chance, because the alternative would be that the Iranians would just continue their attempts to develop a nuclear weapon. And if they succeeded in doing that, you would start a nuclear race in the Middle East. So at least the agreement opens a possibility to monitor what is going on, to control what is going on. So I don't think there is any alternative. In general, I am very critical about the term leading from behind. It doesn't make sense to lead from behind. What we do need is the 45th president of the United States to lead from the front.
There it is. All right, we're going to leave it there. He is former Danish Prime Minister and former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Prime Minister, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.